The forest was quiet tonight. It had been quiet all day, in the way that autumn forests are quiet. Not empty, not still, but settled, as though everything within it had agreed, without needing to discuss the matter, that this was a day for resting, for staying close to the ground, for letting the wind do the moving, and the light do the changing, and the hours pass in their own unhurried way. Edwin knew this kind of quiet well. He had lived inside it for more years than he could easily count now. Decades of mornings and evenings in this particular forest, with its particular sounds and its particular silences, and its particular way of shifting from one season to the next. He knew the sound of wind in these trees in winter, low and steady, like something breathing deeply in sleep. He knew the sound of this same forest in spring, higher, lighter, full of small movements and new things finding their way. He knew the heavy green silence of midsummer, when the canopy grew so thick that the light fell through it in long, drifting columns, and the whole forest floor lay in a kind of permanent soft shade. And he knew autumn. He knew it perhaps best of all. He stepped outside the cottage and stood for a moment on the low wooden step, letting his eyes adjust to the dark. The door closed softly behind him. The latch settled into place with a small, familiar sound, a sound he had heard thousands of times, so many times that it had become part of the texture of his evenings, like the sound of his own boots on the path, and the sound of the wind in the high branches, and the occasional far-off call of an owl somewhere in the deeper parts of the forest. He pulled his coat a little closer. The air was cool tonight. Not cold, not yet, but carrying within it the particular coolness of late autumn, the coolness that arrives in the evening and settles around your shoulders and reminds you gently that the year is turning, that the long, slow journey toward winter has begun. He did not mind this. He had never minded the turning of the year. Edwin reached down and picked up his walking stick from where it rested against the cottage wall. It was a good stick, a long branch of ash wood, smooth from years of use, slightly curved near the top where it had always been curved. He had found it at the edge of the north meadow a very long time ago, and had used it every evening since. It felt like part of the evening itself. He set off down the path. The main path that led away from the cottage was wide enough for two people to walk side by side, though Edwin had always walked it alone. It was covered in fallen leaves now, copper and gold and pale yellow, laid down in soft drifts against the roots of the trees on either side. They moved slightly as he passed, lifted and resettled by the small current of air his walking made. His boots made a soft sound on the leaves, a slow, steady sound. One step, and then the next. No hurry. There was never any hurry on the evening walk. The forest did not need hurrying. The forest had been here for a very long time before Edwin arrived, and it would be here for a very long time after, and it moved at its own pace and asked nothing more of him than that he moved at something close to that same pace. He had learned this early. In his first years here, he had walked too quickly, had carried with him the habit of the world beyond the forest, the habit of purposeful movement, of getting from one place to another efficiently. The forest had cured him of this, not all at once, but slowly, the way the forest did everything. Over months and seasons and years it had slowed him down, had drawn the urgency out of him, the way warmth draws the cold from cold hands, gradually, thoroughly, until one day he had realized he was walking at a completely different pace than he had ever walked before, and that this new pace was the right one, the only one that made sense in here. The trees rose on either side of the path. Old trees, oaks mostly, with their thick, deeply grooved bark, and their wide crowns still holding a few last leaves that had not yet let go. Between the oaks were ash trees, their branches finer and more delicate, their leaves mostly gone now, fallen in the first cold nights of October, and here and there a beech, smooth gray bark, pale and luminous in the moonlight, still holding its copper leaves in dense clusters that rustled softly in the breeze. The moon was bright tonight, nearly full. It sat high above the canopy and sent its light down through the branches in long silver threads that moved when the wind moved, shifting and reshaping themselves across the forest floor in slow, gentle patterns. Edwin watched them as he walked. He had watched moonlight in this forest on hundreds of nights, and it never looked quite the same twice. The angle was always slightly different, the branches in slightly different positions depending on the season and the breeze, the leaves, when there were leaves, filtering the light in their own particular way. Tonight the light was clear and cool and very beautiful. He breathed it in. The path curved gently to the left, and Edwin followed it without thinking, the way you follow a familiar road. Not navigating exactly, but simply allowing your feet to go where they had always gone. His body knew this path, knew every root that crossed it, every slight dip where the ground was lower, every place where the trees grew close enough together that you had to duck slightly to pass beneath a low branch. He ducked beneath the branch. It had been there for as long as he could remember, a great oak limb that had grown out over the path at exactly the wrong height for a tall person. He had ducked beneath it on warm summer evenings and cold winter mornings, and everything in between. And every time he did so, there was something faintly satisfying about it. Some small ritual completed, the forest was quiet and peaceful. Somewhere above him, in the high branches of one of the old oaks, an owl called, a soft sound, not sharp or sudden, but low and round, rising and then falling, the sound of something utterly unhurried, going about its own business in the dark. Edwin paused and listened. The owl called again from the same place. Then there was silence. Then, much further away, an answer, a second owl, distant enough that its call reached him softened by the trees between them, like a voice heard through thick walls. He stood still and listened to the silence after the owl. This was another thing the forest had taught him, how to be still, how to stop walking and simply stand in a place and attend to it, not searching for anything in particular, not waiting for anything specific to happen, but simply being present in the way that the trees were present, the way the fallen leaves were present, without demand and without anticipation. He stood for a little while. The wind moved through the upper branches. The leaves on the path shifted slightly. Somewhere far off, deep in the forest, the owl called once more. Then Edwin walked on. The path descended here into a slight hollow, where the ground was damper and the trees grew closer together. The air in the hollow was cooler than on the higher ground, and it carried the smell of the forest floor, deep and earthy, the smell of leaves decomposing back into the soil. the smell of moss and damp bark and the good dark earth that lay beneath everything. Edwin breathed it in slowly. It was one of his favorite smells. It was the smell of the forest at work, doing quietly what it had always done, returning things to where they had come from. His boots moved through deeper leaves in the hollow. The sound was different here, softer, more muffled, the leaves more damp and therefore less inclined to crunch, and more inclined simply to yield beneath his weight and settle again after he passed. Nothing needed to be hurried. He emerged from the hollow onto slightly higher ground, and the path widened again. To his left, through a gap in the trees, he could see a stretch of open sky. The full moon floating there, impossibly bright, surrounded by the faint silver haze that sometimes gathered around it on autumn nights. A ring of soft light, almost invisible, expanding outward from the moon and dissolving into the dark. He stopped and looked at it for a moment. Then the path turned away from the gap, and the moon was hidden again by branches, and he walked on through the silver-threaded dark. The forest was quiet and peaceful. He reached the old wooden bridge after perhaps 20 minutes of walking. It crossed a narrow stream that came down from the higher ground to the north and moved through the forest in no great hurry, winding between the roots of the old trees, occasionally spreading out into small, still pools where leaves floated and the reflection of the sky appeared. Edwin had watched this stream in every season and in every kind of weather. He had seen it swollen and brown and fast after weeks of rain. He had seen it nearly still in dry summers, reduced to a thin thread of water, moving carefully between the exposed stones of its bed. He had seen it frozen in the deep cold of February, its surface solid and white, the water moving silently beneath the ice. Tonight, it was somewhere between these extremes, a steady, moderate flow, moving quietly over and around the smooth stones of its bed, making the particular continuous sound that running water makes when it has found its right pace and is neither hurrying nor dawdling, but simply going as it had always been going. As it would always go, Edwin stepped onto the bridge. The boards were old and smooth, worn by decades of rain and seasons. They made a low sound beneath his boots, not a creak exactly, but something close to it, a soft acknowledgment of his weight. The handrail was a single length of old wood, worn completely smooth by years of hands resting on it. Edwin rested his hand on it now, as he always did, and looked down at the stream. The moonlight reached the water here, between the trees, and lay across the surface in long silver ripples that moved and shifted with the current. The water was dark beneath the light, but you could see it moving, could see the shapes of the current, the small swirls and eddies around the larger stones, the long, smooth sliding of the flow in the deeper middle. He listened to the water for a while. It was a very good sound to listen to, continuous and gentle, and entirely unconcerned with anything beyond itself. The stream had been crossing this hollow and flowing beneath this bridge before Edwin was born, and it would still be crossing and flowing long after he was gone. And this thought did not trouble him at all. On the contrary, he found it deeply restful. The world was full of things that had been here long before him and would continue long after. The forest, the stream, the moon, the slow turning of the seasons. And to live inside all of this, to be a small and temporary part of it, seemed to him one of the better things a person could do with their time. He breathed in slowly. The cool air above the water was even cooler than the air on the path. It smelled of water and stone and the clean, open smell of moving things. He breathed out. The night moved slowly through the trees. He stood on the bridge for a little while longer, watching the water, listening to it. Then he lifted his hand from the railing and walked on across to the other side. The path on the far side of the bridge climbed gently upward for a short distance before leveling out. Edwin walked it slowly, his stick making its soft sound on the leaves with each step. The trees were different here, a stretch of beeches, their smooth gray trunks rising around him like the columns of a very old and very quiet building, their remaining copper leaves hanging absolutely still now that the breeze had dropped. The moonlight came through the beech canopy differently, more evenly, less threaded, a softer general glow that lay across the forest floor in pale silver sheets. He walked through it quietly. His own shadow moved beside him, faint and elongated, stretching out ahead of him when he walked toward the moon and falling behind him when he walked away from it. The beech wood ended at a natural clearing. It was not a large clearing, perhaps 30 feet across, and it was completely circular, in a way that always seemed to Edwin slightly unlikely for something that had occurred without any human intention. The trees simply drew back from this space and left it open to the sky, and in the center of it the grass grew short and fine, the kind of fine, close grass that grows in places where the light is direct and the ground is firm. He walked into the clearing. The full moon was directly above it. This was one of the places in the forest that Edwin loved most, and he loved it most on nights like this. Clear autumn nights with a full moon and no wind, the kind of nights that made the clearing feel less like a gap in the forest and more like a room, a very particular room with a circular floor and no ceiling and walls made entirely of old trees. He stood in the center of the clearing and looked up, the moon. The sky around it was deep and dark, and in the darkest parts of it, away from the moon's light, he could see stars. Not many, but a few. The brightest ones making their way through even the moon's considerable brightness. He found the ones he always found, the same small constellation he had been looking for in this clearing for 30 years, always in the same place, always the same quiet arrangement of lights. He stood there for a long time. The forest was quiet and peaceful. Nothing needed to be hurried. An owl called from somewhere in the trees at the edge of the clearing. The same owl as before, or a different one, it was impossible to know. The sound rose and fell and dissolved into the dark air, and was followed by the particular silence that follows an owl's call in an autumn forest, a silence that seems somehow deeper than the silence before. Edwin waited in it. Then he turned and walked back the way he had come. The return path was the same path, the same leaves, the same roots, and low branches, and familiar turnings. But walking it in the other direction always felt slightly different. The shapes of the trees changed, the angles of the moonlight shifted, the shadows fell across the path from the other side. It was the same path, and it was slightly different, and this Edwin had always thought was one of the small, reliable pleasures of the evening walk. He crossed the bridge again. The stream moved beneath him, as it always had. He walked through the hollow where the cool air gathered and the smell of the forest floor rose around him. He walked along the wide main path, past the oak with the low branch, ducking beneath it without breaking his stride, and around the long curve that brought him at last back within sight of the cottage. The cottage windows were dark. He had left only the smallest lamp burning inside, set low on the kitchen shelf, and its light was just barely visible from this distance. A faint, warm glow that said simply, without drama, "Here it is. Here is where you belong. Come in, out of the dark." He walked toward it. His boots were damp from the leaves in the night air. His face was cool from the walk. His hands, curled around the handle of his stick, were cool too. And he was aware of them in the particular way you become aware of your hands when they are cool, not uncomfortable, simply present, simply waiting for the warmth that was coming. He reached the cottage door. The latch was cold beneath his fingers. He lifted it and pushed the door open and stepped inside. The warmth met him immediately. It was not a great warmth. The fire had been low when he left and had continued on its own without tending, but it was enough to feel after the cool of the outdoor air, a soft, gathered warmth. The warmth of walls and floor and ceiling, holding the heat of the day and the earlier fire, giving it back slowly, the way stone gives back warmth long after the sun has left it. Edwin closed the door behind him. He hung his coat on the hook beside the door. His stick he leaned against the wall in its usual place. He bent and unlaced his boots and set them on the mat, damp from the leaves, slightly muddy at the heel, and stood for a moment in his socks on the wooden floor. The cottage was quiet. The low lamp on the kitchen shelf made its small amber circle. The last embers of the fire gave a faint glow from the hearth. Outside, the forest settled into its deeper night, and the only sound that came through the thick walls was the very faintest suggestion of wind in the high branches, more a feeling than a sound, a slight breath, here and then gone. He moved to the fireplace. The embers were still warm, and he built the fire back up carefully. Small pieces of wood first, laid gently so as not to disturb the heat, and then a larger log on top. He watched the small pieces catch, watched the flame return, cautious at first, then more certain, then settled and steady. He sat back on his heels and watched it for a moment, feeling the warmth already beginning to reach him. Then he went to the kitchen to make soup. He had made the soup that morning, a simple vegetable soup, nothing complicated, made from the last of the garden carrots and a few potatoes and a handful of dried herbs from the bunch above the stove. It had been sitting in the pot all day and would have deepened in flavor, the way soups do when you leave them alone and let time do its slow work. He lit the gas ring and set the pot on it and turned the flame to low. The soup began to warm very gradually. He could hear it after a few minutes, a very faint sound, barely more than a whisper, as the liquid near the bottom of the pot began to move. Then, slowly, as the heat increased, a thin curl of steam rose from the surface. The smell came with it, warm and vegetable and deeply simple, the smell of something nourishing made from plain things, made without hurry or complication. Edwin stood at the stove and watched the steam. The kitchen was warm now from the fire coming through the low doorway. The lamp on the shelf cast its amber light across the wooden surfaces. The counter, the table, the backs of the chairs, the row of ceramic jars that held flour and oats and dried lentils, and the other quiet supplies of a simple larder. Outside the kitchen window, the garden lay in moonlight. He could see the vegetable beds, empty now for the season, their dark earth soft and resting. The apple tree at the far end, bare of leaves, its branches making clean, angular shapes against the bright sky. The gate in the low stone wall, slightly open as it always was. Beyond the gate, the forest, dark and quiet and enormous and completely peaceful. The soup reached a very gentle simmer, just the occasional slow bubble breaking the surface, and Edwin turned the flame even lower and let it rest there, moving barely at all, keeping warm rather than cooking. He set a bowl on the counter, found the ladle on its hook, poured the soup with the unhurried care of someone doing something familiar, something done so many times it required no more attention than breathing. He carried the bowl to the table. He sat down. He ate slowly. The soup was good, warm and simple and exactly right for the end of an autumn evening. He ate without reading, without thinking about anything in particular, attending instead to the soup itself, the warmth of it, the flavor, the way it felt after the cool of the outdoor air. Between spoonfuls he could hear the fire in the other room, its steady, low voice, and the faint sound of wind in the trees outside. The forest was quiet and peaceful. Nothing needed to be hurried. When the bowl was empty, he sat for a moment with his hands resting on the table, feeling the warmth of the kitchen around him. Then he rose and washed the bowl and the ladle at the sink, and set them on the drying rack, and dried his hands, and turned off the gas ring. He carried the lamp through to the sitting room. The fire was burning well now. The log he had added had caught fully, and was giving a steady, generous heat, its surface glowing deep orange in the places where the wood was burning hottest, and darker toward the edges. The light it made was different from lamplight, warmer, more alive, moving slightly with the changes in the flame, filling the room with a soft flickering amber that moved across the walls and the ceiling in slow, unhurried waves. Edwin set the lamp on the small table beside his chair. His chair was an old one, a deep armchair, slightly worn at the armrests, its cushion compressed by years of sitting into a shape that was very specifically the shape of Edwin sitting in it. He lowered himself into it with the slight care that age required, and felt the familiar give of it, the familiar way it received him without any adjustment, simply accepted him as he was. He pulled the blanket over his legs. It was a thick woolen blanket, dark green, worn at one corner where it had spent years folded over the same place. He tucked it in around his sides. He rested his hands in his lap. Outside, the forest was very quiet. He could hear the fire beside him, its soft crackle, the occasional small settling sound as the log shifted fractionally, the low, continuous exhale of warm air rising up the chimney. He could feel its heat on the side of his face, steady and gentle. He could see, without turning his head, the movement of its light on the ceiling above him. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, not yet, simply to rest them, to let the lamplight and the firelight become something felt rather than seen, a warmth across his eyelids, a gentle reddish glow moving slowly in the dark behind them. The forest was quiet and peaceful. The night moved slowly through the trees. He breathed in. The air in the cottage was warm and smelled of the fire and very faintly of the soup, and beneath both of those things the older smell of the cottage itself, wood and years, and the particular quiet that accumulates in a place that has been lived in slowly and well. He breathed out. Nothing needed to be hurried. He let his thoughts move as they wished, which was not very far in any particular direction. They arose and drifted and dissolved in the way that thoughts do when the body is warm and the fire is low, and the evening has run its full course and arrived at this, at last, the final stillness at the end of a quiet day. He thought briefly of the clearing, of the moon above it, enormous and still. He thought of the stream, of the sound it made, moving over the smooth stones beneath the bridge. He thought of the owl, of the way its call had risen and fallen, and been answered by a second voice further in the dark. These thoughts were not sharp or demanding. They did not pull at him or ask to be followed anywhere. They were simply there, the way the fire was there and the blanket was there, warm and present, and without any urgency at all. His hands were heavy in his lap. His shoulders had dropped some time in the last few minutes, without him noticing, released some tension he had not known he was carrying, settled lower against the back of the chair. The fire made its soft sound outside. The wind moved through the tops of the trees, that slow breathing sound barely there, more suggestion than sound, the forest exhaling slowly in the dark. Edwin's breathing had slowed in, slowly out, slowly. The fire was warm, the room was still. His head grew heavy, not unpleasantly, but in the way that heads grow heavy at the end of long and quiet days, a comfortable heaviness, a weight that was simply the weight of rest being earned and now arrived. He did not fight it. There was nothing to fight. The evening was over, and the walk was done, and the soup was finished, and the fire would take care of itself for another hour yet. And outside the forest was doing what the forest always did, resting, breathing, continuing its slow and enormous life in the dark. Nothing needed to be hurried. His breathing slowed a little more. The firelight moved across his closed eyelids, orange and warm. Gentle, he breathed in. The cottage held him. He breathed out. The forest was quiet. The trees stood as they had always stood, enormous and patient and completely at peace, their roots deep in the dark earth, their branches moving slowly in the high autumn air, their leaves coming down one by one in the dark, settling on the path where Edwin had walked, covering his footprints softly, gently, the way snow covers everything, the way silence covers everything, without any sound at all. The stream moved beneath the bridge. The moon moved above the clearing. The owl was somewhere in the deep forest, still now, resting in the high branches of an old oak, with its feathers puffed and its eyes half closed, and the whole forest spread out beneath it in the silver and dark of a perfect autumn night. And here in the cottage, warm still, Edwin breathed in slowly, and out. The fire was low now, just the warmth. His hands rested in his lap, heavy and still. His breath came and went, quietly, slowly, without any effort at all. The lamp made its small light. The blanket was warm. The forest breathed outside. Slowly, steadily, the way it had always breathed, the way it would always breathe. And Edwin rested, deeply, quietly, held by the chair and the blanket and the warmth of the fire and the deep, familiar peace of this small cottage in the middle of the enormous and quiet and endlessly patient forest. His breath in, out, slow. The night moved gently through the trees. The leaves came down, one and then another, and then, settling softly on the path, on the bridge. On the still surface of the stream, everything resting, everything quiet, everything held inside the soft and endless dark of an autumn night that had no hurry in it anywhere, no hurry at all, just the forest, just the dark, just the slow and gentle breathing of everything in and out, and in, and the fire barely there now, just warmth, just light, just this, just rest,